On the evening news footage, a woman stands on the shoulder of a rural road. Behind her, police tape, a lake, the dim glow of flashing lights, and people with flashlights. The camera trembles slightly in the wind. Lauren McDonald holds a photograph of her husband, Brian, and tries to speak calmly, but her lips are trembling. She explains that he went fishing early in the morning, as he always did on weekends. He said he would be back by lunch. He didn't return. His phone isn't answering. Later, his boat was found on the shore. His things were inside: tackle, a folding chair, a thermos of coffee. Only Brian himself was nowhere to be found. The journalists show the lake from different angles. The scenery looks familiar: water, reeds, a wooden pier, a lopsided guard shack. But the atmosphere is different. The camera catches the reflection of searchlights on the water, creating a feeling that the entire place is frozen in time. Police officers bustle on the shore. Several men in volunteer vests walk in a line, looking carefully at the ground. In another scene, a drone flies slowly over the lake. Not a trace, not a hint that a person was ever here. The next day, posters with Brian's photograph are put up around town. The picture is ordinary. He's sitting at a table in the garden, a mug in his hands, a faint smile on his face. The caption is simple: Brian McDonald is missing. Any information is important. People from neighboring areas come to help with the search. At the headquarters, there are boxes of water, thermoses, and two-way radios. The news shows brief segments. A volunteer recounts how they've been combing the wooded area from morning till night, but so far they've found nothing. Lauren appears on air again. This time she looks exhausted. Her hair is tied back, her voice slightly hoarse. She thanks everyone who is helping and says she will keep searching until she finds him. A reporter asks how the family is feeling. She replies that she is trying to hold it together, but at some point she simply falls silent and turns away. The camera captures this moment, holding the shot on her face a little longer than necessary. Detective Edward Naish sees this story in the evening while sitting at the precinct. It seems to him that something about Lauren's behavior doesn't match the situation. She cries, but too neatly. She says the right words, but as if from a script. And then there's one detail. There's no ring on her hand. Or rather, there is a mark from a ring, a pale band on her ring finger. The detective notes this in his notebook. A small detail, but a strange one. People don't take off their rings on days like these, especially when they're certain they are still waiting for their spouse to come home. The next morning, he drives out to the lake. The area is cordoned off and divers are at work. On the shore, there are wet boot prints and piles of collected items. Everything is neat, with no signs of panic. The boat is fine, the tackle untouched. No signs of a struggle, no footprints of other people. It all seems frozen, like a staged scene. Naish speaks with an officer who was on duty at the site. The officer says Lauren was calm, not hysterical, not getting in the way, and answered questions briefly. When asked to show them her husband's home, she said she was ready to go right away. This is also strange. Most people in such a situation aren't thinking about formalities. That evening, while reviewing the interview recordings again, Naish notices that Lauren almost never looks into the camera. She often glances to the side, as if afraid to make eye contact with someone behind the lens. The detective realizes this story isn't about how a person disappeared. There's something else here, something Lauren is trying to hide. And so, a simple case of a missing fisherman becomes the beginning of an investigation that will change the entire town's understanding of family, love, and trust. Before Brian's disappearance, the MacDonald family seemed to be an example of an ordinary, quiet, but stable life. They lived on the outskirts of a small American town, in a house with a sun-faded facade and neatly trimmed bushes by the porch. A white mailbox with the name MacDonald stood by the road, just like hundreds of their neighbors. From the outside, everything looked flawless. A tidy yard, a clean car, curtains in every window. At first glance, it was a life of nothing but routine and predictability. Brian worked as a manager at a local car dealership. He was respected by his colleagues, though some noted that he could be hot-tempered. He was often late, sometimes came in with a hangover, but he knew his job. He could sell any car just by looking a customer in the eye and speaking with a confidence that suggested he believed every word himself. He had a reputation as a man who loved risk but didn't always know when to stop. After work, he often went to Harper's Corner, a local bar frequented by nearly everyone in the neighborhood. There, he would sit alone, slowly drinking one beer after another. People said that in recent months he had become nervous and irritable, as if something was eating him from the inside. Lauren, on the other hand, gave the impression of a quiet, composed woman. A nurse, night shifts, chronic sleep deprivation. She rarely appeared outside during the day. She was more often seen in her uniform, rushing to work or returning home in the early morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, recalled that Lauren almost never smiled, but always said hello. Sometimes she would come out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and sit for a long time, staring into space. Everything seemed normal, but there was something weary in her gaze, as if she were a person living on inertia, expecting nothing new from life. The neighbors considered them a couple of few words. They didn't argue loudly or make scenes. They were polite but kept to themselves. They didn't attend holiday gatherings and rarely had guests. An almost constant silence reigned in their house, broken only by the sound of the television and rare arguments that could be heard through the thin walls on particularly tense evenings. A few times, a neighbor heard the front door slam shut, sharply, forcefully. Then, silence. But this surprised no one. Everyone understood that families go through difficulties over the years. Later, during the investigation, the police would describe the MacDonald's home as clean but lifeless. In the kitchen, everything was scrubbed spotless, but the refrigerator was nearly empty. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, divided by an invisible line. The left side lived its own life, the right side its own. On Brian's side of the bed were fishing magazines, a couple of empty beer cans, and an old alarm clock that hadn't worked in a year. On Lauren's side were books on patient care, a notebook with jottings, and a small photograph tucked into the cover, a picture of her and Brian, taken many years ago on a picnic. In the photo, they are laughing, the sun shining in their eyes. But the smiles were from another life. Lauren's colleagues recalled that she had changed in recent months. She started paying more attention to herself, wore perfume more often, and came to work a little earlier than usual. Sometimes she left later, explaining that she needed to finish a report or cover for a colleague. It would later turn out that this coincided with the night shifts of a paramedic named Neil Carson. At the time, no one connected these coincidences. But after Brian's disappearance, these details began to form a chain. By then, the couple's relationship was essentially held together by habit. They lived side by side, but had long since stopped being part of the same life. Lauren no longer told her husband about her work, and Brian stopped asking. Sometimes she would cook dinner, but eat alone. He would come home later, open a beer, sit down in front of the television, and could stay there until midnight. They didn't fight openly, but the coldness in the house was palpable. If the neighbors suspected anything, they didn't interfere. No one expected that behind this silence lay not just fatigue, but something far more serious. On the outside, a perfect picture: a house, a car, a stable job. Inside, two people living parallel lives. And when Brian disappeared, Lauren knew that her life could finally change. Only this time, the changes didn't start the way she had planned. It was here, in this quiet house, that what would later become a case that shook the entire county began. Monday morning begins with anxious phone calls. At the car dealership where Brian worked, his absence is noticed within an hour of opening. This is uncharacteristic for him. In 10 years of service, he had never missed a shift without warning. His manager thinks that perhaps he is sick. First, they call his cell, then his home. The phone doesn't answer. On the line, there is only a ringing tone and the short beep of an answering machine. By noon, a colleague of her husband's arrives at Lauren's house. She opens the door in a robe, her eyes swollen. She speaks quietly, as if she has already prepared for the conversation. He went fishing and didn't come back. They found the boat on the shore. Her voice trembles, but there is a strange calmness in her demeanor, as if all of this had already happened in her mind before. The man offers help, asks if she has called the police. She replies that she was about to. That same day, Lauren files a missing person report for her husband. The officer on duty takes the report without many questions. The situation is standard: an adult male missing during a recreational outing. In such cases, the first 24 hours are considered crucial, but for now, no one suspects the worst. The search begins. Volunteers, divers, and canine units are brought in. The area around the lake is combed, square by square. Each day brings reports, but no results. A temporary headquarters is set up on the shore: a tent, plastic tables, radio stations. In the evenings, volunteers, officers, and relatives gather here. A map with marked search zones hangs on a wall. People look at it wearily, understanding that the search area is closing in, but there are no new leads. The weather changes. First rain, then a thick fog over the water. After several days of searching, it becomes clear. It's as if Brian simply vanished. Journalists get involved on the third day. The news shows footage of the lake, interviews with police officers, and short statements from Lauren. She appears before the cameras, composed, neatly dressed, holding a photograph of her husband. Reporters ask the same questions. When did you last see him? Did he have any enemies? Were there problems in the family? Lauren answers calmly, but repeats the same thing. He just went fishing. He loved this place. He was supposed to come back. With each passing day, hope dwindles. On the 7th day, the search officially continues. But inside the department, they are already preparing a new case classification. When a person disappears without a trace, without financial activity, without any calls, it stops being just a missing person case. They begin to consider the possibility of foul play. Detective Edward Naish, who had been observing the case from the beginning, takes it under his personal control. He starts by examining Brian's personal belongings. Keys, wallet, documents, all were left at home. This is unusual for someone who was supposedly just going fishing. Even his phone, according to Lauren, he had supposedly forgotten. But the fact that the boat was found with the motor in working order and the tackle inside raises Naish's suspicion. An experienced fisherman would not be so careless with his equipment. With each new report, the situation becomes more convoluted. There are no witnesses who saw Brian that day. The nearest gas station has no surveillance cameras. No one remembers seeing his car parked by the lake in the morning. The police check the roads, question residents, all to no avail. It seemed as though the man had simply disappeared, dissolved into the fog. Lauren continues to play the role of the concerned wife. She gives interviews, cries, thanks the volunteers. But the detective notices. Her emotions are turned on as if by a script. She cries when a camera is pointed at her and falls silent immediately after the filming stops. She shows no interest in the details of the search, asks no questions about the progress of the investigation. For Naish, this is a signal. Such small details are rarely a coincidence. 10 days after Brian's disappearance, the police change the status of the case. It is no longer a missing person. It is an investigation into a possible crime. And the first person to become the center of attention is the one who, it would seem, is suffering the most: his wife. When the McDonald case is handed over to Detective Thomas Riley, it has already become a topic for all the local news outlets. Posters with Brian's face hang at bus stops, and volunteers continue to walk the shores of the lake. But it's all more of a formality by now. Riley takes the case files at a moment when public attention is beginning to wane. For him, this is a normal point, when emotions die down and he can calmly focus on the facts. He reviews Lauren's statement, then the search party reports and neighbor testimonies. Everything seems standard. No conflicts, no debts, no threats. But experience tells him that such cases are rarely simple. He doesn't believe in random disappearances without a trace, especially if a person goes to a familiar place and doesn't return. Riley starts with the most obvious. He rewatches the television interview where Lauren sits before the camera, clutching her husband's photograph. He rewinds the recording several times, pausing frames to study the details. Her posture is tense, her gaze directed slightly to the side. She speaks evenly, almost mechanically, as if reading from an internal script. But that's not what catches his attention. Riley notices that every time the journalist asks a question about their personal relationship, Lauren pauses briefly, lowers her eyes slightly, and purses her lips. This isn't the reaction of someone reminiscing about a loved one. It's the gesture of a person hiding irritation. He makes notes. He marks the time of the frame, then rewinds again. And then the detective's eye catches a detail that seems insignificant but strange. There is no wedding ring on Lauren's right hand. In the spot where it should be, a faint mark is visible, a pale band on her skin, as if from a recently removed piece of jewelry. She claimed that she and Brian lived happily, that they were planning a vacation, and spoke of him as a man she adored. But why is the ring gone? Riley doesn't jump to conclusions. He knows that such small details can be coincidental. But habit forces him to look for logic even in the little things. He requests a copy of the interview to watch the recording in better quality. This time, he turns on the sound and listens carefully. Lauren's tone changes depending on the topic. When talking about her husband, her voice becomes strained, cold. When talking about the search, it becomes softer, almost demonstratively compassionate. The detective realizes that this woman is not as simple as she tries to appear. He checks the timeline. According to Lauren, Brian left to go fishing on Saturday morning and didn't return home. But cell phone data shows that Brian's phone was turned off the previous evening. This means something happened even before the trip. Riley decides to start by questioning Lauren, but he doesn't rush. He needs more context. He sends a request to the hospital where she works and the car dealership where Brian was employed. The replies come quickly. Lauren's colleagues describe her as diligent but reserved. One of the paramedics mentions that she often stayed after her shift, sometimes not going straight home. The detective makes a special note of this fact. At the same time, he studies the materials on Brian himself. He had a few run-ins with the police for drunk and disorderly conduct, but it all ended with fines. There were no financial problems, minimal loans. The only thing that stands out from the overall picture is a recent life insurance policy for a large sum, taken out just a month before his disappearance. And the beneficiary in the document is listed as Lauren. These facts don't prove anything yet, but they are forming a certain pattern. Riley knows. In cases like this, there are no small details. And if you strip away the emotions, what remains is a chain of actions that will lead to the truth. He returns to the interview recording, pausing on the exact moment when the camera focuses on Lauren's hands. The wedding ring is indeed gone. The mark on her skin is fresh. For an experienced investigator, this is not just a detail, it's a turning point. Outwardly, she is worried about her husband. But the symbol of their marriage, it seems, was removed in advance. This means that Brian's disappearance did not catch her by surprise. She was ready. It is with this thought that the real work on the case begins. Riley pauses on the frame showing a close-up of Lauren's hand. The light from the studio spotlight reflects off her skin, and on the screen, a thin, light mark around her ring finger is clearly visible. The mark is even, untanned, and fresh, as if the ring was removed very recently. The detective zooms in on the image, takes a screenshot, and sets down his pen. To a trained eye, such details speak louder than words. A woman who claims she had a happy marriage would be unlikely to remove her ring on the same day she reported her husband missing. He returns to the missing person report and reads it again. Lauren stated that her husband left the house in the morning, took his fishing rods and a thermos, and promised to be back in the evening. Not a word about an argument, not a hint of conflict. Everything is neat, restrained. But when Riley compares this with the mobile operator's records, the timeline begins to fall apart. The last signal from Brian's phone was recorded on Friday evening, almost 12 hours before his supposed departure for the fishing trip. This means he either never left the house at all, or someone else used his belongings later. Riley knows that unless you scrutinize the details, the truth won't surface. He calls in his colleague, Officer Grant, to conduct a second interview with Lauren. At the meeting, she is calm, even overly so. She speaks briefly, confidently. Her face shows fatigue, but not confusion. She doesn't ask for updates on the search, nor does she show interest in technical details. All she repeats is, "I just want him to be found." Riley watches her gestures. Her hands are folded in her lap. The ring is gone. On her finger, that same pale mark. He decides to deviate slightly from the interrogation script and asks a mundane question. "Have you been wearing your ring long?" Lauren winces slightly, says she doesn't remember. Then she adds, "I sometimes took it off at work so I wouldn't scratch a patient." The answer is formally logical, but the detective knows. A ring doesn't leave such a mark if it's taken off from time to time. Such a mark appears if it's worn for years and then suddenly removed for good. After the meeting, Riley writes a short phrase in his report. Lauren McDonald, behavior inconsistent with stated emotions. From this moment, he stops viewing her as a victim. She is now a person of interest. He reviews the family's finances. In Brian's bank account, there is a significant insurance policy, taken out shortly before his disappearance. The beneficiary, Lauren. The amount, $250,000. The policy was activated a month ago. And it gets more interesting. His wife's credit card statement shows purchases from a jewelry store a week before her husband's disappearance. Unexplained expenses, new clothes, a plane ticket to Texas in her name, with a departure date 3 days after Brian went missing. To someone else, this might just be a coincidence, but not to an investigator. Riley starts to feel that the story of the disappearance on a fishing trip doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Everything is too calculated, too clean, as if someone had prepared for this in advance. And Lauren's behavior, steady, without emotional spikes, resembles not despair, but control. He requests a warrant to search the house. While the document is being processed, Riley looks at the printed frame from the interview. At that very hand, without a ring, with a white band. For him, this is not just a visual detail. It is a symbol, a boundary, after which she ceased to be the wife of the missing man. A new note appears in his files. Priority subject for observation. From this point on, the McDonald case ceases to be a story of an accidental disappearance. It becomes an investigation into a possible crime, with Lauren McDonald at its center. First, Riley sends an official request to the hospital where Lauren works. The response arrives 2 days later. There are several inconsistencies in her duty roster archive. Reports indicate she was on shift on days when she was, in fact, seen outside of work. The management explains it simply: possible confusion with shift swaps. But the detective knows that such excuses usually cover up personal arrangements between employees. He decides to speak with the staff personally. In the medical unit, he is met with caution. Lauren's colleagues try not to say too much, but one name comes up several times: Daniel Hayes, a lab technician. Young, sociable. He worked night shifts with her. According to the staff, they often arrived and left together. One nurse recalls seeing them leave in the same car. Officially, they never had a work-related conflict, but rumors were circulating. Riley makes a note: establish nature of relationship. The next step is to detail their phone records. When the report from the mobile operator arrives at the police station, everything becomes clear. Lauren's number and Hayes's number are linked by hundreds of calls. Over the last month, there were more than 300 outgoing calls, most of them at night, between midnight and 4 in the morning. Some lasted over an hour. Riley looks at the dates and sees a correlation. The day before Brian's disappearance, there was a call between them lasting almost 90 minutes. After that, not a single one. No messages, no attempts to contact each other. Complete silence. For an investigator, this is a typical pattern: intense communication, then a sudden cutoff. Someone was clearly scared and decided to disappear from view. Riley summons Hayes for questioning at the precinct. The young man comes with a lawyer, nervous, trying to appear calm. He says that he and Lauren were just friends, that they sometimes chatted at night to pass the shift. But under the pressure of the facts, his voice trembles. When the detective reads out the dates and duration of the calls, Hayes looks away and admits they were indeed close, but, in his words, it doesn't mean anything. Riley doesn't comment. He knows that behind such words there is almost always much more than a person is willing to admit. He simply asks, "When was the last time you saw Brian McDonald?" Silence. Then Hayes answers, "Never, only in pictures." This confirms there was no personal contact between them, but knowledge of the husband was most likely present. After the interrogation, the detective returns to the case files. Now the puzzle is coming together more clearly. Lauren was having an affair, which she carefully concealed. Her husband had a large life insurance policy, and the disappearance happened at the exact moment she had an opportunity to start a new life. A coincidence? Too many coincidences to be random. He calls in a team of officers and gives an order. Check all the cameras on the roads around the McDonald's house and the hospital for the last 10 days. On one of the recordings from a gas station, filmed on Friday evening, a dark car similar to Lauren's is visible. The camera doesn't capture the license plate, but the silhouette behind the wheel matches her height and build. The time is 10:47 p.m., the exact moment Brian's phone stopped responding. Riley doesn't pass judgment until he has confirmation. But internally, he is already certain. Lauren's connection with Hayes was not just emotional. It was a factor that could have been the trigger. A new entry appears in his report: motive established, personal relationship, and financial gain. At this stage, the investigation changes direction completely. Now, the police are no longer searching for a missing person. They are searching for proof that he is gone and for the person who arranged it. When the investigation gets the first pieces of evidence about Lauren's connection to Hayes, Detective Riley decides to check if she had been preparing for what happened. He sends a request for surveillance camera footage from around the hospital and nearby pharmacies. Analyzing the footage takes several days. All the clips have to be reviewed manually because the video storage system is old, without automatic filtering. But the effort pays off. On one of the recordings, dated 2 weeks before Brian's disappearance, Lauren is clearly visible at the counter of a small pharmacy located directly across the street from the hospital. In the video, she is standing at the cashier with a plastic basket. Inside are ordinary items: a bottle of water, a couple of packs of vitamins, but among them, the pharmacist notes one prescription-only medication. It is a powerful drug with a strong sedative effect, prescribed for severe sleep disorders. The doctor who issued the prescription is in the database. He is indeed an employee of the same medical facility. But there is no record of Lauren seeing him as a patient. Riley contacts the pharmacist who was on duty that day. The man remembers her. He says she was calm, unhurried. But there is a detail that raises a flag. She asked not for the standard 10-dose package, but for the maximum, a 50-dose one. For someone suffering from insomnia, this makes no sense. But if the drug were used differently, it could explain a lot. The investigation checks whether Lauren actually had access to such prescriptions. As a nurse, she could have obtained them through the internal system if she had asked a doctor to write one for a relative. And this is later confirmed in the hospital database. The prescription was issued in the name of a colleague from her department who was not on shift that day. The doctor signed the document without looking, out of a habit of trusting his staff. This data becomes crucial for Riley. Now the picture is beginning to take on the shape of premeditation. He connects the time points: the purchase of the drug, 2 weeks before the disappearance; the last calls with Hayes, the day before; the deactivation of Brian's phone, Friday evening. Everything points to the fact that the event was not sudden. It was prepared. The detective returns to the pharmacy camera footage and notices another detail in the background. After the purchase, Lauren walks to her car, and in the passenger seat, a man is visible. A blurry silhouette, but one that matches the build of Daniel Hayes. It's a brief episode, only a few seconds, but it confirms they were acting together. Riley orders a check of her bank transactions. On her statement for that day, there is a charge for the exact cost of the purchase. Paid by card, the receipt issued in the name of Lauren McDonald. No attempt to cover her tracks. For him, this is a signal. She didn't expect anyone to ever analyze this. It means she felt safe, confident that her plan would leave no traces. The investigation compares this fact with neighbors' testimonies. A week before Brian's disappearance, one woman saw Lauren carrying a large plastic container, which usually stood in the garage, out of the house. When asked what it was, she replied, "Old things, taking them to the country house." At the time, no one paid attention. Now, every small action takes on meaning. The purchase of the sleeping pills becomes a key detail. Not just strange, but indicative of preparation. Lauren had no trouble sleeping, but she did have a person who was getting in the way of her new life. For the investigator, this isn't a theory, but a sequence of logical steps. He records in his report, "Suspect's actions are systematic. Element of planning is present. Purchase of medication indicates intent to use the substance for a non-prescribed purpose.
From this moment, the story ceases to be about a missing husband. It becomes a case about a woman who knew in advance what was going to happen and carefully prepared the ground to make the disappearance look like an accident. When Riley obtains a copy of the pharmacy receipt, he immediately notices that the medication was dispensed not under Lauren's personal prescription, but with a document issued in another name. The pharmacy database lists a patient with the surname Morgan, an elderly woman who was a patient at the hospital where Lauren worked.
At first glance, everything might seem legitimate. A nurse could have simply been helping a colleague, picking up medicine for a patient. But something doesn't add up. There is no recipient's signature in the pharmacy's transaction log, and the purchase itself was made with cash, with no card specified. Riley knows. If someone wants to leave fewer traces, this is exactly how they do it. He contacts the hospital's records department to verify the patient's data. The medical facility's archival system is old, so the request is processed manually. A day later, he is given copies of her charts, admission logs, and discharge records. And it is here that everything falls into place. The medical history indicates that Mrs. Morgan had passed away in the therapy ward a month before the medication was purchased. This means that the prescription Lauren used to acquire the sleeping pills was issued in the name of a person who was no longer alive. For the investigator, this is not just a violation. It is direct proof that Lauren used her professional access to forge a fictitious prescription. He checks who had access to the patient database on that day. The logs show the system was accessed from Lauren McDonald's user account. Time, 9:14 p.m. Date, exactly 1 day before the medication was dispensed. The activity log notes that patient Morgan's chart was opened, a prescription was printed, and a note was added, continuation of treatment. No doctor was on duty at that time. It all looked like a carefully planned forgery. Riley understands that this is the key piece of evidence. Now there is no doubt. Lauren was not just hiding an affair and lying about her husband's disappearance. She was preparing for the event in advance, and to do so, she used the system where she worked. Such an action cannot be explained by accident or oversight. It requires intent, time, and an understanding of how everything works from the inside. The detective goes to the hospital and calls the head of the department in for a talk to confirm the data. She looks bewildered. She says Lauren was an experienced nurse, disciplined, with no reprimands. No one expected this from her. When Riley shows her a copy of the prescription, the department head turns pale. She confirms the doctor's signature, but adds, "This doctor hasn't worked at the hospital for several months." This means the signature could also have been inserted manually, a scan from past documents. After this, an internal audit begins at the department. Riley receives a report stating that the prescription file was created on Lauren's work computer, and after the purchase, the medication was written off from the inventory as if it had been dispensed as prescribed. Everything was neat, without errors. But a digital footprint remains within the system, the user ID that modified the file. This becomes the turning point in the case. All theories about an accident or Brian leaving of his own accord are now dismissed. The purchase of sleeping pills with a fake prescription confirms that conscious actions were behind the disappearance. Lauren used her knowledge and access to carry out an operation that an ordinary person could not have pulled off. Riley files the materials in the dossier and makes a note: falsification of medical documentation, use of a deceased patient's data, objective to obtain a controlled substance. This wording leaves her no room for excuses. Now the investigation enters a new phase. The investigators move from checking the circumstances to searching for physical evidence, the kind that can confirm that after the drug was purchased, events unfolded just as Riley suspects. Once the investigation has evidence of the forged prescription, Riley takes the next step. He needs to understand why Lauren needed the drug at all. By itself, a sleeping medication doesn't seem dangerous if used as prescribed. But what if it was part of a premeditated plan? To confirm or refute this, the police turn to a toxicologist from the County Laboratory Center, Dr. Raymond Hall. Riley brings him a copy of the prescription and a description of the drug. Hall reviews the data, flips through a reference book, and makes notes in his notebook. After a short pause, he says, "In combination with alcohol, this substance acts differently. Even a small dose causes severe respiratory depression and a rapid loss of consciousness." Riley asks him to clarify how rapid. The expert replies, "Minutes, sometimes less. The person doesn't even have time to realize what's happening." The detective asks for a practical assessment to determine what quantity of the drug might have been used if the goal was not treatment. In the lab, they run a simulation. They dissolve a standard dose in a liquid and analyze the decomposition time. The result is recorded. The drug is colorless, tasteless, and odorless. In a hot beverage like coffee or in alcohol, it dissolves completely. When the toxicologist learns that Brian regularly drank whiskey before bed, the expert's reaction becomes more serious. He explains that the combination with this particular drink is the most dangerous. Alcohol enhances the drug's effect several times over. In a state of mild intoxication, a person loses control of their body and within a few minutes simply falls asleep. Meanwhile, everything looks natural externally. No convulsions, no noise, no signs of a struggle. Riley records this in his report: possible rapid loss of consciousness without external signs of impact. This information completely changes the context of the case. Now the investigation understands. Lauren could have used the drug not as a means of care, but as a tool. Given her medical knowledge, she was well aware of the dosage and consequences. No accidents, only precise calculation. Further analysis shows that the timing of the sleeping pill purchase, the day of the disappearance, and Brian's last confirmed presence at home all coincide within a 2-week window. Everything indicates that this drug was the first link in the chain. Riley cross-references neighbors' testimonies and timestamps from bank transactions. On the evening Brian stopped answering calls, a payment for a liquor delivery order goes through on his card. That same evening is the last time his phone was active. Investigators return to the McDonald's house with a warrant for a second search. In a kitchen cabinet, they find an empty package of the same sleeping pills that were purchased with the fake prescription. On the inside of the lid, investigators find Lauren's fingerprints. In the trash can are disposable cups. At the bottom, there is a residue of liquid with a characteristic chemical trace that matches the drug. After laboratory analysis, the theory is definitively confirmed. The expert concludes, if you dissolve 3 to 4 tablets of this substance in a glass of alcohol, a person loses the ability to move and speak within a few minutes. At the same time, they simply appear to have fallen asleep. For the police, this is the missing link. Now the fishing trip story completely falls apart. No person in such a state could have gathered their things, left the house, and disappeared. Everything suggests that Brian lost consciousness inside the house, and afterward, the traces were meticulously cleaned up. Riley notes in his report, possibility of using the drug for neutralization purposes has been proven. Suspect had the knowledge, access, motive, and means. The theory of voluntary departure is ruled out. This becomes the moment when the investigation definitively transforms from a missing person case into a case with signs of a planned crime. Ahead lies the most difficult part: proving what happened after the drug took effect. Once the investigation has gathered all the evidence, Detective Riley's attention shifts to the person whose name constantly appears in Lauren's phone records: Daniel Hayes, an orderly at the same hospital where she worked. Young, athletic, with no criminal record. At first glance, he's just an ordinary guy who got caught in the middle of someone else's story. But for the investigation, he is a potential accomplice. Riley calls him in for questioning. Daniel comes on his own, without a lawyer. He sits down, clearly nervous. He knows the conversation will be unpleasant. The detective turns on the recorder and starts with a direct question. "Were you in a relationship with Lauren McDonald?" A pause. Then a short yes. No attempt at denial. He says the affair began about 6 months ago, and that Lauren claimed her relationship with her husband was effectively over. She said that Brian drank often, had become irritable, and that there had long been nothing left in the house but fatigue and resentment. Daniel says they met at her work and a couple of times at his place. He claims he had nothing to do with Brian's disappearance and only learned about it from the news. According to him, he was at a party with friends out of town that evening and can prove it. The detective asks for the names of who was there. A day later, all 3 friends confirm his story. His car is visible on the security footage near the country club. The time matches. Riley listens carefully and notices that Daniel is genuinely confused. He isn't defensive, isn't looking for excuses, isn't trying to shift the blame. He simply doesn't understand how deeply he's caught in someone else's plan. When the investigator shows him the photo of the pharmacy purchase, the young man turns pale. He admits he heard Lauren complain about insomnia, but didn't know she was using someone else's prescriptions. The detective asks a clarifying question. Did he speak with her on the day of Brian's disappearance? Hayes confirms, yes, there was a call in the evening, but it was brief. She said that everything was settled and asked him not to text for a couple of days. At the time, he didn't think much of the phrase, assuming she was talking about divorce papers. When Riley asks him to describe their last few meetings, Daniel recalls that in the weeks before the incident, Lauren seemed calm, even a little distant. There was no nervousness, but there was a sense that she had already made up her mind and was just waiting for the right moment. He says this not as an accusation, but more as a memory that is now making sense. After the interrogation, investigators check everything that could confirm or refute Hayes's words. Phone records show that on the day of Brian's disappearance, he was indeed in another part of the county. No traces connected to the case are found in his car.
No large transactions on his bank accounts. Everything is consistent with the behavior of someone not involved in the crime. For the police, this is a major turning point. Hayes is excluded from the list of suspects. Instead, he becomes a valuable witness who can confirm Lauren's emotional state and motive. It is from him that investigators learn she had spoken several times of a new beginning, of a life without the past. Phrases that sounded harmless at the time are now seen as preparation. Riley notes in his report, "The suspect was engaged in a long-term affair with a colleague, hiding it from her spouse. The witness confirms the presence of a motive, a desire to be free of old obligations. Hayes's alibi has been confirmed. The probability of complicity is nil." Now the picture is complete. Lauren acted alone.
She planned everything, from buying the drug to staging the disappearance. And the man for whom it was all done never even suspected he had become part of her scheme. After the interrogation, Daniel leaves the station, but it is his words that give the investigation direction for its next step. The detectives decide to return to Lauren's original story, the fishing trip. They need to understand exactly where, according to her, Brian was planning to fish, and whether that place could have been the point where it all ended. When the investigation rules out the lover as a suspect, Riley returns to the main subject, Lauren herself. Everything she did seemed rational, methodical, and emotionless. And this raises another question. Why did she take such a step if she could have just left? To understand, the detectives begin to dig deeper, to where real motives are usually hidden. The first thing they check is the McDonald family's financial situation. On the surface, everything looked stable. Brian worked as a car dealership manager with a steady income, and Lauren was a nurse working night shifts. They owned their home together, and the mortgage was almost paid off. But when the investigation requests bank statements and credit histories, a different, less prosperous picture emerges. In the months leading up to Brian's disappearance, large sums of cash were regularly withdrawn from their joint account. Some of it was transferred to a personal account of Lauren's that her husband didn't know about. Another detail. A few weeks before the incident, she tried to increase the insurance policy in her husband's name, citing new mortgage terms. The policy was for $250,000, payable in the event of an accident or disappearance. Riley contacts the insurance company to check the date the application was filed. It was submitted 3 weeks before Brian supposedly went fishing. The signature on the documents matches hers. The handwriting is hers. Investigators find a copy of a prenuptial agreement among Lauren's personal documents. In the event of a divorce, the mortgaged house would be split equally. Lauren would be left without a significant portion of their assets and would also lose access to Brian's retirement savings. This meant that a divorce would leave her with almost nothing. When these facts are shown to Daniel Hayes, he confirms that Lauren often talked about money, not in a greedy way, but as a matter of control. She was afraid of being dependent, of starting from scratch. He remembers her once saying, "I won't let all my years go to waste." He didn't think anything of it at the time. Now, the meaning was obvious. The investigators also look into the family's past. Several neighbors report that conflicts often arose between the couple. Not loud, argumentative fights, but tense ones. Lauren kept everything inside, but one neighbor saw her sitting in her car outside the house for about an hour, just staring at a single point. At work, she was calm and didn't complain, but her colleagues noted that in recent months she had become colder, as if she had distanced herself from everyone. All these details form a single narrative. Lauren was not acting on emotion. Everything she did seemed calculated. Financial gain, the fear of losing her accustomed standard of living, the unwillingness to start over. All of this became the real reason. Riley prepares a report for the prosecutor. The document states, "The suspect had a direct financial interest in her spouse's disappearance. Her actions indicate premeditated preparation for the purpose of financial gain. Motive confirmed." This is enough for the court to issue a search warrant for the McDonald home. Now, the investigation needs not only to prove that Lauren planned everything, but also to find traces of what happened on the night Brian stopped communicating. Riley assembles a team and they head to the location. The house looks immaculate, as if the owner were expecting guests. But the detective knows that real evidence isn't left in plain sight. It's always hidden in the details, under a layer of cleanliness, behind perfect order, in places even the residents rarely look. Early in the morning, around 8 o'clock, a police car stops in front of a neat brick house in the suburbs. Riley gets out first, a search warrant signed by the county judge in his hand. He is followed by 2 forensic specialists with equipment and an officer with a camera to record everything. It all has to be documented. Lauren opens the door almost immediately, as if she were waiting. She's in casual clothes, her hair is tied back, and she's wearing no makeup. There is no panic in her demeanor, but there is a wariness, that cold composure of someone who knows the game is up. Riley calmly presents the document. He speaks officially, without emotion. "Mrs. McDonald, we have a warrant to search your home. I ask you not to obstruct the investigation." She gives a short nod and steps aside, letting them in. The house looks perfect. Not a speck of dust, not a single thing out of place. Even the smell is neutral, as if it has just been deep cleaned. The forensic team starts in the living room, then follows the standard procedure: kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. Riley inspects the walls, noting how thoroughly the floors have been washed. This doesn't look like ordinary cleanliness, but rather an attempt to erase everything that could be a reminder of that night. In the basement, they find several bottles of bleach, all opened. One has fresh fingerprints on it. When a forensic specialist turns on an ultraviolet light, faint stains appear on the concrete wall. Riley asks for luminol. After it's sprayed, the surface glows with a pale blue light, a characteristic reaction to traces of blood. They move on to the garage. The concrete floor there is freshly washed, but the chemical smell is stronger. A forensic specialist gets on his knees and sprays the reagent. Within seconds, the entire section of the floor by the door lights up in a network of glowing streaks. Riley makes a note: traces of blood washout over an area of approximately 2 square meters, probable incident zone. Lauren watches the investigator's actions, standing in the doorway. Her face is completely indifferent, only her hands are trembling slightly. When Riley turns to her, she tries to hold his gaze, but her eyes eventually dart away. Several items are seized from the garage: rubber gloves, a bucket, a towel with the remains of a brown stain, and a roll of polyethylene sheeting. Everything is packaged according to protocol. On the workbench, a forensic specialist finds a small metal object, a broken piece of a ring. Riley immediately recognizes the characteristic curve. It looks like part of Brian's wedding band. When the evidence collection is complete, the detective approaches Lauren. He speaks calmly, without pressure. "Lauren, you need to come with us. We have some questions to ask." She replies quietly, "I've already told the police everything." Riley motions for her to come outside. An officer meets her with handcuffs, but doesn't rush to put them on. Formally, this isn't an arrest yet. At the station, the interrogation takes place in a standard room with a one-way mirror. On the table are only the case file and a voice recorder. Riley sits across from her. He speaks without threats, in the tone of someone who wants to understand. "Lauren, did you know your husband was insured for a large sum?" "Yes," she answers curtly. "You submitted documents to change the terms 3 weeks before he disappeared." "It was Brian's idea. He wanted to protect us." "But his signature isn't on the application, only yours." She remains silent. Riley opens the file and shows her photos from the garage. The blue glow on the concrete floor, the gloves, the bucket, the bleach. Then he places the metal fragment of the ring on the table. "We found this at your house. It matches his wedding ring." Lauren looks at the photos without saying a word. Only her breathing becomes faster. The detective pauses, then adds, "All the evidence indicates that Brian never left this house alive." She closes her eyes, as if trying to collect her thoughts. A minute later, she opens them, straightens up, and her voice becomes cold. "You can't prove anything." The interrogation ends there. But Riley already knows. A confession is only a matter of time. The evidence speaks for itself. The next day, the prosecutor's office issues an arrest warrant. Lauren McDonald is now officially a suspect in a premeditated crime. The house is sealed, and all materials are sent for forensic analysis. Riley understands that there is one last task: to find out where exactly Brian McDonald's story ended. And the answer to that is likely where it all began, at the old pier where, according to Lauren, he had supposedly gone fishing. When the investigative team returns to the house after the interrogation, the atmosphere seems to have changed. The silence no longer feels like mere emptiness. Now it is oppressive, filling the air with anxiety. Riley stands at the entrance, silently watching as the forensic specialists set up their equipment, shine flashlights into corners, and check every inch. The McDonald house no longer looks like a cozy suburban home. Now it is a place where everything speaks of a carefully concealed secret. The investigators decide to go through the basement. They hadn't gone down on the first day. There were no formal grounds, and Lauren claimed the space hadn't been used in a long time. But now, with a warrant giving them unrestricted access, Riley insists. Check everything, even what seems unnecessary. The basement is cramped and low-ceilinged, with low-hanging beams and a smell of dampness. There are old stains on the concrete floor, but nothing looks suspicious. Boxes, plastic containers, and old belongings are stacked neatly along the walls. In a corner are several cans of paint, a pile of rags and garden tools. Only one object seems out of place: a massive chest freezer, old but well maintained. It is covered in a thick layer of dust, even though everything around it has been cleaned spotless. Riley moves closer. The lock doesn't just look closed. It's sealed with gray duct tape, several layers wrapped crosswise. It doesn't look like a precaution, but rather an attempt to seal the lid permanently. The detective notices that the plug is neatly coiled and the power cord is pushed aside. The outlet is empty. All of this gives a strange impression, as if someone didn't just stop using the freezer, but did everything possible to ensure no one could ever open it. The forensic specialists photograph the freezer from all angles, documenting every detail. One of them carefully removes the tape, while another prepares a tool to break the lock. The metal creaks, the lock clicks open, and the basement becomes surprisingly quiet, like the calm before a storm. When the lid is lifted, nothing happens at first. But a second later, a cold, heavy air rushes out, as if the cold itself has exhaled. Everyone instinctively takes a step back. The smell is distinctive, metallic, with a faint sweetness. Riley, despite having seen a lot, feels the muscles in his face involuntarily tighten. He signals to the expert, "Document everything immediately." Under the lid are several bundles, neatly stacked in layers. Each package is wrapped in thick construction plastic and bound with electrical tape. Everything is done meticulously, methodically, like someone accustomed to order who leaves nothing to chance. It is striking, even within this monstrous discovery, there is a sense of cold rationality. Not chaos, not panic, but a plan. The forensic team does not touch the contents until the medical examiner's group arrives. Everything is documented: videos, photographs, descriptions. At the bottom of the freezer, they notice a metal object, the handle of a knife with a broken blade. It is corroded, but there is a handprint on the handle, as if someone had held it recently, despite the freezer being unplugged. Riley stands aside, not interfering. He just watches. Everything that had happened up to this point, guesses, hypotheses, psychological profiles, now loses its meaning. Before him are the facts, cold and indisputable. The evidence speaks louder than any confession. While the forensic team continues its work, the house gradually fills with people. Representatives from the prosecutor's office, experts, and photographers arrive. Reporters gather outside. News of the discovery spreads instantly. The house, which had recently been just a part of a quiet suburb, becomes the epicenter of a high-profile case. A few hours later, after the freezer's contents have been completely removed and sent for analysis, the lab provides the initial results. The biological analysis confirms the remains found belong to Brian McDonald. The DNA match is 100%. Lauren's fingerprints are on the electrical tape used to wrap the bundles. The plastic sheeting used for packaging is a perfect match for the roll found in the garage. Every detail fits together. Every action Lauren took now takes on new meaning. The purchase of the sleeping pills, the cleaning of the garage, her cold-blooded television interview. None of it was a reaction to shock. It was the continuation of a plan. Riley returns to the station. He doesn't rush to report. He just sits at his desk and looks out the window. In his many years of service,
He has seen a lot. But what strikes him about this case is not the cruelty, but the calculation. The way a person could turn an ordinary life into a meticulously constructed stage set. He closes the case file and says aloud, quietly, as if to himself, "That's it. She can't get out of this now." But there is still one step left, the confession. Not in documents, not in evidence, but from her own mouth. Riley knows that for people like Lauren, confessing is not a weakness, but a final attempt to maintain control. And now he is ready to listen. An oppressive silence hangs in the interrogation room. The air is still, as if it too is afraid to disturb what is about to happen. A cold metal table separates two people whose lives are now intertwined by one thing only, a confession. A lamp burns above the table, its light falling squarely on Lauren MacDonald's face, highlighting her weary features, the slight tremor in her fingers, and the particular expression of someone who sees no way out. She is wearing a simple gray sweater, her hair is tied back, and her face is free of makeup and any attempt to wear a mask. She is not resisting, but she is not surrendering either. She just sits and waits. Riley enters without a file, without notes, without assistance. His footsteps are crisp and measured, as if every movement has been thought out in advance. He sits across from her, places his palms on the table, and for a moment just looks. Over the years, he has grown accustomed to different types of suspects. Some try to justify themselves, some are aggressive, some hide behind feigned indifference. But in Lauren, he sees something else, an inner emptiness, scorched and cold. Not fear or despair, but a silence within. And that silence needs to be broken. He begins without pressure, in a calm voice, as if speaking not to an accused woman, but to someone he has known for a long time. "You realize that from here on out, there's only the truth, right?" he says. Lauren doesn't answer. Her eyes remain empty. Only her eyelashes tremble slightly. Riley doesn't press her. He opens a file and takes out several photographs. Pictures are laid out on the table. The basement, the freezer, the concrete with the luminol glow, the fingerprints, the evidence tags. Lauren lowers her gaze, but her expression doesn't change. She looks at the photographs as if they are something distant, unrelated to her. Riley waits a few seconds, then says quietly, "This isn't just a series of coincidences. You knew we would find it all eventually." No response, just slow, heavy breathing. Then he pulls out the last picture, the one he saved for the decisive moment. A still frame from her television interview. It shows Lauren on the day she cried in front of the cameras, asking for help to find her husband. And in close-up, her hand, her ring finger, with no ring on it, only a smooth, pale mark on the skin, like an imprint from a past life. Riley turns the photo toward her and says, almost in a whisper, without any pressure, "You said it all yourself back then. You took off the ring before you went to the police. Why?" This time, the silence doesn't last. Lauren tenses, her shoulders rise, and her fingers grip the edge of the table. For a few seconds, she tries to maintain her composure, but her breathing becomes uneven. Her gaze flickers, then drops. She closes her eyes as if to hide. Riley waits. He doesn't say a word. When she finally speaks, her voice is hoarse, as if coming from deep inside her. "I didn't want it to be like this. It got out of control." The detective silently turns on the voice recorder and places it between them. Lauren talks for a long time, without hysterics, without excuses. Everything, step by step. How the thought of escaping her husband first seemed like just a dream. How she met another man with whom she felt alive for the first time. How that dream gradually turned into a plan. Vague at first, just an idea. If only I could start over. Then the sleeping pills. Then the bottle of whiskey. Then the moment when it became clear there was no turning back. She says that on that night, everything seemed calm. They were sitting in the kitchen, talking. Brian poured himself a whiskey. She mixed the drug into it. It all happened without shouting, without a struggle. Just silence. Then she realized what she had done and got scared. At first, she wanted to call the police, then changed her mind. She said she never believed she would go through with it, that all along she had hoped she would find a way to stop. But the moment to do so had already passed. She recounts this as if telling someone else's story. Without tears, without emotion. Only at the end does her voice break, and she says, almost in a whisper, "I just wanted it all to be over." Riley turns off the recorder. He sits in silence for a few seconds, then stands up. There is no satisfaction on his face, only fatigue. This is not a victory. It is an end that makes no one stronger. He walks to the door, but stops for a second and says, "You knew he would have found you anyway, even without the police." He leaves, and the door closes softly behind him. The room is quiet again. Lauren is alone. Her hands are still trembling, but a strange expression appears on her face, as if, for the first time, she can breathe easier. The confession, whatever it was, releases the last of the tension. Meanwhile, behind the glass, officers are documenting her testimony. The investigation has a full confession, corroborated by all the physical evidence. The MacDonald case now officially moves to the trial phase. But for Riley, this is not just a case. It is a story of how a person can, step by step, build a trap of lies for themselves, and then fall into it. There will be a trial, prosecutors, a jury. But the real conclusion already happened here, in this room, under the light of a single lamp, where the lies ended and the truth began. After Lauren's confession, the investigators move to the next stage, a reconstruction of the events. In the police office, photographs, floor plans, call logs, Lauren's work schedules, and even receipts from the pharmacy and supermarket are laid out. Every detail now becomes part of the bigger picture. Detective Riley carefully studies the sequence of events. Everything that once seemed like a meaningless collection of facts now forms a logical and cold chain of actions. According to the investigation, it all began on a Friday evening. That day, Brian came home earlier than usual. He looked tired,
But, as Lauren recounted, he suspected nothing. For several weeks, tension had filled their home. Infrequent conversations, averted gazes, evenings spent in separate rooms. Nevertheless, that evening she offered him a drink, to just sit like old times. An open bottle of whiskey, his favorite brand, was on the kitchen counter. In a small bowl were a lemon, ice, and a pinch of sugar. Everything looked natural, homey. According to her, she secretly added crushed sleeping pills to one of the glasses. The drug was potent. A few milligrams were enough to induce a deep sleep. She had calculated everything in advance. Her medical knowledge and hospital shifts helped her understand dosages better than any pharmacist.
When Brian took the glass and took his first sip, nothing changed. They talked for a while longer, discussing trivial things. Lauren tried to act calm, as if nothing unusual were happening. Half an hour later, he felt drowsy. He decided to lie down on the living room sofa, saying he was too tired. Lauren waited. Time, she said, seemed to stretch on. She sat across from him, watching as her husband's breathing grew deeper, as he gradually lost consciousness. Once she was sure the drug had taken effect, she moved closer. She described her subsequent actions almost mechanically, without emotion, like someone who had replayed it all in their head long ago. The detective's report states that she used a pillow to make it look like an accident. No screams, no noise, just silence. The neighbors heard nothing, and this coincidence was her saving grace in the beginning. It all happened quietly, quickly, and predictably. After that came the stage that investigators called the most terrifying in its cold-bloodedness. Lauren did not panic or try to flee. She acted with calculation. First, she cleaned up the traces on the sofa, then brought a blanket, wrapped her husband in it, and left him in the room. She spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, sitting in the dark. By morning, when the sun came up, she already knew what to do next. The next few hours were key to understanding her state of mind. She called in to work and took the day off, blaming fatigue. Then, around noon, she changed her clothes and went to the garage. She spent most of the day there, she said. It was the same place where forensics later found traces with luminol. She moved her husband there herself, slowly, step by step, using a sheet to avoid leaving tracks. There, she turned on a radio to drown out any sounds. Experts later determined it was an old receiver found on a shelf. It had been playing all day, creating background noise. Lauren described what happened in the garage without emotion, almost dryly, as if recounting someone else's job. She said she didn't know what to do and decided to make it so no one would find him. This was not a decision made in panic, but the consistent logic of a person trapped in their own plan. To hide the evidence, she used kitchen knives and a small garden saw. All of these were later found by forensics, thoroughly washed, but with microparticles that were recovered through spectral analysis. She planned to dispose of the evidence gradually. Some things would be thrown in the trash, others hidden. But her plan was cut short. She couldn't see it through to the end because the investigation had begun. The television interview, the volunteer searches, the media attention, all of it was unexpected and intensified her fear of being exposed.
Realizing she could no longer get rid of the evidence, she simply sealed the freezer and unplugged it, hoping the police would never make it to the basement. It was her final move, after which she tried to live as before. She went to work, met with colleagues, even attended church on Sundays. Investigators would later call this behavior a textbook example of a double life. For several weeks, she remained confident, until the investigation uncovered the first serious piece of evidence, the tan line from her ring. It was this detail that shattered the entire facade she had been hiding behind. When the reconstruction was complete, Riley noted that the most striking thing about the whole case was not the crime itself, but how meticulously it had been planned. This wasn't a flash of rage or an accident, but a cold sequence of steps thought out in advance. After this reconstruction, the case officially moved into the legal phase.
All that remained was to bring it to trial, where a judge and jury would hear the story not from investigators, but from Lauren's own mouth. And it would be there, in the courtroom, that the truth would be given its official weight. The trial of Lauren MacDonald began 6 months after her arrest. During that time, investigators had prepared a colossal amount of material: expert reports, interrogation transcripts, chemical analysis results, and crime scene photographs. All of it now lay before the jury, neatly arranged in stacks on the long oak tables of the county courthouse. The atmosphere was heavy, tense. Everyone who came understood. This was not just a trial, but the conclusion of a story that had shaken the entire county. Lauren was brought in under guard. She wore a simple, dark blue dress with no jewelry, her hair neatly tied back. At first glance, she was an ordinary middle-aged woman. No emotion, no remorse, no anger. She sat with her gaze lowered, as if she didn't see what was happening around her. Since her confession, she had made no further attempts to justify herself. Her words were already recorded, and that recording became the centerpiece of the case. The prosecutor began with a short but sharp speech. He didn't raise his voice or resort to dramatic phrases. He simply listed the facts, step by step, coldly and precisely. The illegal purchase of a potent drug, using a deceased patient's prescription. Then, the phone calls to her lover, made on the night of Brian's disappearance. Next, the traces of blood found in the garage, the forensic results confirming the DNA match. And then, the security camera footage of Lauren buying the drug. And finally, the confession she made herself during the interrogation. The jury listened attentively. There was no horror on their faces, as one might expect. Instead, there was a look of bewilderment. Many couldn't believe that the person sitting before them had cold-bloodedly destroyed her own husband's life, and then, for weeks, played the role of a grieving wife for the cameras. The defense tried to build its case on Lauren's mental state. Her lawyer spoke of pressure, chronic fatigue, emotional burnout, mentioning marital problems, and a possible dependence on sleeping pills. He argued that the crime was not premeditated, that it was an impulsive act stemming from a prolonged crisis. But all his arguments crumbled against the facts: the purchase of the drug 2 weeks before the incident, the preparation, the cleanup of the evidence, the false missing person report. All of it pointed to the opposite, to planning and calculation. At one point, the prosecutor played the interrogation recording. Lauren's voice filled the courtroom, even, calm, devoid of emotion. She described each action as if it were a routine task. Those few minutes were the turning point. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the judge stopped taking notes. When the recording ended, no one said a word. The confession was more powerful than any argument. Next, the experts testified. A toxicologist confirmed that the combination of sleeping pills and alcohol would have guaranteed a loss of consciousness within 20 minutes. The medical examiner described the sequence of actions established through evidence analysis. A psychologist who had worked with Lauren after her arrest noted that she felt no guilt, only regret at having been caught. These words cemented the perception of her as a cold, calculating individual. After several days of hearings, the judge handed the case over to the jury. They had to review the materials, deliberate, and reach a decision. It took them almost 6 hours. All this time, Lauren sat motionless. No tears, no attempts to speak to her lawyer, as if she were awaiting the inevitable. When the jury returned, the courtroom rose. The foreman read the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. There were no gasps, no sighs of relief, just silence. The judge thanked the jury and proceeded to sentencing. He read it calmly, without fanfare. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lauren listened without raising her head. After the judge's words, she was escorted from the courtroom. She did not resist or look back. As she left, reporters tried to catch her eye, but she walked past as if none of it mattered anymore. After the sentencing, the McDonald case was officially closed. The investigator's report stated that the motive was the desire to keep the house and the money while getting rid of her husband. A cold-blooded, rational decision, driven by neither passion nor a fit of rage. Only calculation. Detective Riley, who had been present at the trial, would later say in an interview, "This is one of those cases where you don't feel a sense of victory, just emptiness." Because behind the truth, there's always a ruined life, and not just one. From that moment on, the name Lauren McDonald ceased to be just a line in a case file. It became a symbol of cold betrayal and human duality, of the fact that evil does not always look frightening. Sometimes it is quiet, reserved, and lives under the same roof for years before showing its true face. After the trial, the town seemed to fall quiet. It felt as if even the familiar rhythm of the streets had changed, as if the very atmosphere was different. The neighborhood where the McDonald house stood was no longer the quiet, safe place people had known. Now, people avoided that house, even when just walking their dogs. The windows were boarded up, the yard was overgrown with weeds, and someone was always stopping at the gate, just to look, as if to reassure themselves that it had all been real. Lauren was sent to serve her sentence at the state women's prison. Since then, she has not given a single interview, nor tried to explain or justify herself. Her name vanished from the news, but not from the town's memory. Her file would appear before the parole board for many years to come, but the court's decision precluded any possibility of release. She would remain there forever. Her former colleague, The man with whom she had the affair changed his name and moved to another state shortly after the verdict. At first, he tried to carry on, continuing to work, but the media attention and constant reminders of the case left him no chance. His photograph was published in the news, reporters stood outside his building, and neighbors whispered behind his back. He simply disappeared, and no one ever heard from him again. The neighbors, who had recently called the McDonalds an exemplary couple, were now reluctant to recall those times. In interviews with local media, they repeated the same words. They always seemed so normal. Always said hello. Always smiled. No one would have thought something terrible was going on there. This phrase was repeated so often that it became almost symbolic of the whole story, a reminder that anything can happen behind closed doors. Psychologists would later call this case a classic example of a double life. On the outside, a perfect family, a successful marriage, stability. On the inside, coldness, lies, and a constant tension that one day erupted into the irreparable. Researchers said that this was the terrifying aspect of such stories. Evil doesn't scream or draw attention to itself. It is quiet, polite, and smiling. It can live alongside you for years, until one day it reveals its true face. After the verdict, the McDonald case was incorporated into training programs for detectives. It was analyzed as an example of how crucial it is to pay attention to details, the smallest ones, those that seem insignificant. The tan line from a ring, a drop of luminol, a discrepancy in the timing of a phone call. Each of these small things was, in fact, the thread that unraveled everything. Detective Riley, who saw the investigation through to the end, gave a brief interview after the trial. He didn't use grand phrases or show any emotion. He simply said, "Every lie cracks sooner or later. Sometimes it's because of a huge miscalculation, and sometimes it's because of something so small it surprises you. But the crack always appears." These words were later quoted in local newspapers and on social media, becoming a kind of epilogue to the case. The town's residents would remember the McDonalds for a long time whenever they passed their old house. For some, it was just a reminder that no one ever knows what goes on behind other people's walls. For others, it was almost a parable about the impossibility of building a life on lies, no matter how well planned they are. After this case, the county police department revised many of its approaches to investigating domestic crimes. A new term appeared in reports, behavioral silence, referring to when a person appears calm on the surface, but their behavior has changed in subtle ways. Such observations are now documented separately, as they were often overlooked in the past. Several years have passed, but the case is still mentioned in conversations. The town has changed. It has become more wary, more observant. People have started to look differently at what happens around them. In a way, this is the legacy that Brian left behind. His story became a warning to others. Riley once said that in investigations, there is no absolute victory. There is only restored truth. But the truth doesn't heal. It just puts things back in their proper place. So it was here. Justice was served, but the town was never the same. Trust, once lost, does not return. It remains in the past, just like the house where it all began, standing on a quiet street, grim and abandoned. Like a keeper of someone else's secret, a secret that was finally torn out into the open.